A few days ago, a young woman reached out to us through Reddit. She said she had a confession she couldn't tell anyone in her real life, but she trusted us to share it exactly as she wrote it. This is her story. I stared at the office door, praying it wouldn't open. My hands were damp against the file I was holding, my pulse loud enough to drown out the ticking of the wall clock. I told myself it was nothing, just another late night, just another stack of reports to drop off. But my legs felt rooted to the floor, as if my body already knew what my mind refused to imagine. When the handle turned, time slowed. The fluorescent light above me hummed, flickering for a split second, and in that pause, I caught his scent before I saw him. That familiar cologne, the one that clung to our sheets at home, the one he wore on our wedding day. It rolled in with him like an unwelcome memory. He stepped through, half shadowed by the hallway light, and I could hear the low murmur of his voice. It was the same voice that used to whisper to me in the quiet hours before dawn. But he wasn't speaking to me. There was someone behind him. A laugh drifted out, soft but close. I tilted my head just enough to see past the doorframe, and in that instant, my chest tightened. My boss, the one I answered to every single day, stood there. Only, he wasn't just my boss. He was my husband. Their eyes met briefly, as if they'd been caught in a place neither of them should be, yet neither moved to explain. My brain fought to connect the pieces. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same watch I bought him for our anniversary. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. The air in the room shifted. My vision blurred for a moment, but I forced myself to keep looking, because if I looked away, I could pretend I'd imagined it. But I hadn't. They were there, together, in the same space that I had walked into 100 times before. Only this time, it was no longer my workplace. It was a crime scene for my marriage. I wanted to speak, to shout, to demand answers, but my voice never came. All I could do was watch as he stepped fully into the room, the door closing behind him with a quiet click that felt louder than a slam door. My husband, my boss, the same one. What I discovered that night made me question if I ever knew the one I married. If you've ever trusted someone with your life, only to find out you never truly knew them at all, you'll understand what I'm about to share. This is Midnight Confession, where people speak the truths they carried in silence, the kind that gnaw at you when the lights go out and the world thinks you're asleep. Every story you hear here is real, told by the people who lived them. These are the moments they never thought they'd say out loud, until now. Some stories will leave you angry, some will leave you uneasy, and some will make you question everything you believe about love, loyalty, and the masks people wear. If you think you can handle the truth that hides in plain sight, stay. Subscribe so you don't miss the confessions people can't share anywhere else. Now, back to the night I realized my marriage and my career were both built on the same lie. I had always believed that love was supposed to feel safe, predictable, even. The kind of safe where you don't have to wonder if the person beside you will still be there when you wake up in the morning. When I met Daniel, it felt like I had finally found that. He had this calm, steady way about him, like nothing could shake him. The kind of man who made you feel protected without even trying. I'd been through enough in my dating life to know how rare that was. We met at a small coffee shop near the university where I was finishing my degree. He was sitting by the window, reading some thick, leather-bound book I couldn't quite make out. The sunlight hit his face just right, and there was this faint smile at the corner of his mouth. Not the kind of smile you give to impress someone, but the kind you have when you're perfectly content in your own world. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the first thing about him that drew me in. His ability to seem self-contained. Like nothing could touch him. Like he belonged to no one, but everyone wanted to belong to him. He was polite, attentive, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. In a world full of noise that felt rare, he asked questions about my life, not just surface-level ones, but questions that made me pause, think, even laugh at myself. And when he told me about his work, he kept it simple. He said he was in management, which I assumed meant something corporate. I didn't press. People have a right to privacy. I thought. We dated for a year before he proposed. The proposal wasn't flashy. It was quiet, intimate, in our apartment, with a simple ring and his voice shaking ever so slightly as he asked me. I said yes without hesitation. The first months of marriage were everything I'd hoped for. We'd cook together, go for late-night walks, binge-watch old films. He worked long hours, but he always came home smelling faintly of that same cologne, sandalwood and cedar, and he'd kiss me on the forehead before collapsing onto the couch beside me. It was the life I thought I wanted. Around that same time, I landed a new job, the kind of opportunity I'd been chasing for years. A prestigious firm downtown, the kind of place with glass walls and marble floors, where the air smells faintly of polished wood and ambition. I remember my first day so clearly. I was nervous, clutching my portfolio like it was the only thing keeping me upright. They led me to the boardroom to meet the executive director, my new boss. The room was dimly lit, a strange choice for midday. A single long table stretched down the center, and at the far end, someone was sitting with their back to me. The blinds were half drawn, thin lines of sunlight cutting across the walls. When he turned his head slightly, I could see the outline of his jaw, sharp and defined. He didn't stand right away. Instead, he gestured for me to take a seat opposite him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep, steady, and controlled, the kind of voice that could both comfort you and command you at the same time. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His eyes caught the light just enough for me to notice they were a strange shade of gray, almost like steel. He spoke to me politely, but there was an air of distance, as if he'd built invisible walls no one was allowed to cross. He kept the conversation brief, told me he valued professionalism above all else. No unnecessary small talk, no distractions. That was fine with me. I was here to work. Over the weeks, I came to learn that he rarely attended company gatherings. He'd often send an assistant in his place, preferring to keep to his office behind a heavy, frosted glass door. People whispered about him in the break room, that he'd been with the company for years, but no one really knew much about his personal life. No family photos on his desk, no wedding ring. He was a mystery, but the kind people respected enough not to question. At home, my life with Daniel was still steady. He worked late too, so sometimes we'd miss each other during the week, but weekends were ours. Or at least, that's what I believed. The two worlds, my home life and my work life, felt completely separate. There was no overlap. My husband and my boss existed in different spaces, different contexts, like parallel lines that would never meet. Looking back, I realized how carefully that separation had been crafted, how meticulously someone had ensured the two worlds remained apart. There were little things I should have noticed earlier. The first time I mentioned my boss to Daniel, his reaction was almost too neutral. No curiosity, no follow-up questions, just a nod and a change of subject. At the time, I chalked it up to disinterest in my work gossip. And then there was the watch. My boss wore a timepiece I'd only ever seen once before, the exact same model I'd bought for Daniel on his last birthday. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Expensive watches aren't one of a kind, after all, but the moment that still stands out happened 3 months in. I stayed late one evening to finish a report. As I passed the frosted glass of my boss's office, I heard the faint sound of music, the same jazz record Daniel liked to play on Sunday mornings. It was such an oddly specific choice that it made me pause. Still, I brushed it off. I had no reason to suspect anything. No reason to connect the two men who seemed, on the surface, so entirely different. If you'd asked me then to describe my life, I would have told you I was happy. Married to a woman I loved, working for a company I respected, building a future I could be proud of. I didn't know that beneath that carefully constructed normalcy, the truth was waiting, patient, quiet, for the moment it would finally step out of the shadows and change everything. If you'd looked at my life then, you'd have said I had it all figured out. A home filled with laughter, a husband who told me I was beautiful even when I just rolled out of bed, a job that challenged me and made me feel like I was finding the path I'd worked for. Daniel and I had our routines. Saturday mornings were for farmers markets. He'd sample the cheeses while I filled a basket with fresh bread and fruit. Sunday evenings were for opening a bottle of wine and sitting on the balcony, watching the city's lights blink on one by one. At work, my boss, Mr. Gray, had this ability to make you feel like your work mattered. He wasn't warm, exactly, but he was attentive. If you did a good job, he noticed. If you made a mistake, he pointed it out, not to shame you, but to make sure you never repeated it. In a strange way, I admired him for that. There were coincidences, harmless ones. I told myself, the first time I brought a bottle of wine to one of our office celebrations, Mr. Gray commented that it was his favorite, the exact same rare Merlot Daniel loved, the one we kept for special occasions. And the watch. I'd given Daniel that watch on our first anniversary, a limited edition, engraved with his initials on the underside. Mr. Gray had one that looked identical. I'd only caught a glimpse of it once, in a meeting, when he reached for a pen. Same brush metal, same dark leather strap. At the time, I thought, it's just fate. Funny, harmless fate. But fate doesn't destroy lives. People do. It was late, close to midnight, and the office was nearly empty. I'd stayed to finish a project, my desk lit only by the desk lamp's warm glow. That's when I heard it, my name, not the casual way colleagues say it. This was slower, softer, drawn out in a way that made my skin prickle. It was coming from Mr. Gray's office. His door was ajar, and I could hear him on the phone. Yes, I saw her today. She looked tired, he said, almost as if it were an observation meant for someone who cared. I froze. The way he said it felt personal, like he wasn't talking about an employee. When he noticed me passing, he ended the call abruptly. Just a quick, we'll talk later. At home that week, Daniel started coming in later than usual. He claimed the restaurant he was managing had extended hours because of a new seasonal menu. His excuses were believable enough until I started noticing how vague they were. No details, no specific stories about his nights. The overlap was subtle, but there, I began to feel a strange undercurrent, like the two men who lived in these separate spaces of my life were semi-sharing the same pool of knowledge about me. And I kept asking myself, what would you do if your partner and your boss seemed to know the same secrets? The company's annual charity gala was the kind of event everyone dressed up for. Black tie, champagne, polished speeches. I arrived early, in a long black dress Daniel had picked out for me, expecting to spend the night networking and making polite conversation. From across the ballroom, I saw Mr. Gray. He was speaking to a group of board members, the light catching that same steel gray gaze I knew so well. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Daniel. He was wearing the exact same tailored suit Mr. Gray had on. Same cut, same subtle stitching at the lapel. But what made my stomach drop wasn't the suit. It was the smile. That exact same half smile they both had, as if they shared some inside joke with the world. I moved toward Daniel, ready to introduce him to my colleagues. But when I got there, he extended his hand to my boss and said, James. James. My husband called my boss James, and my boss smiled back and called my husband by a completely different name. I stood there, caught in a loop I couldn't escape. Two men, the same men, or so it seemed, using different names as if they were swapping coats in a cloakroom. That's when it hit me. I didn't know either of their real names. After that night, nothing felt real. I couldn't sleep without replaying the scene over and over. I started waking up in the middle of the night, slipping out of bed to check Daniel's phone, scrolling through messages, bank alerts, anything that might explain it. At work, Mr. Gray seemed different, colder. He kept our interactions strictly professional, never meeting my eyes for more than a second. At home, Daniel was overly attentive, bringing me flowers, cooking dinner, but it felt staged like a performance. A week later, I got an email. No subject line, no signature. Just one sentence. Ask him about the night in Chicago. The words burned into me. I didn't know if they were talking about my boss or my husband, or if somehow it was both. I kept staring at the screen, asking myself, if someone sent you that message, would you confront them or stay silent? I decided I couldn't ignore it. One Thursday evening, I followed Daniel after work. I stayed far enough behind that he wouldn't notice, blending into the crowd as he moved through the city streets. He didn't head toward the restaurant. Instead, He turned into a quieter neighborhood and stopped in front of an unmarked apartment building. Inside, I crept up the stairwell until I could hear him speaking. The voice was unmistakable. The same tone I'd heard in meetings, in my home, on the phone that night at the office. When he left, I slipped inside. The apartment was minimal, almost clinical. No family photos, no personal mementos. Just a desk, and on it, a small lockbox. Inside the box, I found passports. 3 of them, each with a different name, but all with the same face. His face. There were bank cards, stacks of cash, and a row of prepaid burner phones. And then it all clicked. My boss and my husband weren't just the same men. He was living 2 fully separate lives, both under false identities. The prestigious firm I worked for was a front. My marriage was a cover. And the man I loved was running an underground financial scheme. But that wasn't even the worst part. The moment the truth hit me, it wasn't with the crashing thunder of a movie climax. It was quiet, so quiet that it felt like the world had taken a single, sharp breath and was holding it, waiting for my reaction. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where we had shared countless breakfasts, late-night take-hide, whisper plans for our future. The FBI file lay in front of me. Its manila edges were worn, creased from the agent's hands as he'd slid it across to me earlier that day. It contained everything, every transfer, every falsified ledger, every document I had signed without reading too closely because I thought I was just streamlining the paperwork for the firm. The agent's words still echoed in my head. Whether you knew it or not, you've been laundering money for him for almost 2 years. I remember my throat tightening as if the truth itself was pressing on my windpipe. I had been the perfect employee, the perfect wife, and in my perfection, I had been the perfect cover. That night, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to. Is this... The voice hesitated. His wife? I froze. The caller identified himself as Special Agent Riley from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. His tone was calm, controlled, too controlled. He told me they'd been investigating my boss for months, but the trail led somewhere unexpected. My home, my bank account, my name. I didn't speak for what felt like minutes. When I finally did, my voice came out in a whisper. You're saying my boss and my husband are the same person? There was a pause on the other end, the kind that says everything words can't. The next morning, they called me in. The room was colder than I expected. Not the kind of cold you feel in your skin, but the kind that seeps into your bones. The kind that tells you you're in a place where truth has to be extracted like a splinter. 2 agents sat across from me, a recorder between us. They wanted my cooperation. They needed my testimony, but then they told me he'd been brought in too, and he wanted to see me. Every cell in my body screamed no, but curiosity, or maybe closure, pulled me toward that gray steel door. When I stepped inside, he was already seated. No suit, no wedding ring, just a plain gray shirt, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked up, and for a moment, he smiled. Not the smile of my husband, not the charming grin of my boss. Something else. Something I'd never seen before. They told me you'd come, he said softly. His voice was familiar, but stripped of all pretense. It felt like hearing a stranger speak through someone I thought I knew. I sat down across from him, my hands trembling under the table. Why? It was the only word I could manage. He leaned back, almost casually. I told you once. He said, I'd never lied to you. I just never promised to tell you everything. I felt the sting of betrayal sharpen. But then, as if to twist a knife, he said something that almost knocked the breath from my lungs. You don't even know my name. I frowned, confused. I know your name, I said, almost offensively. 2 of them, actually. He shook his head slowly, almost pityingly. And then he said it. A name I had never heard before. It wasn't the one I'd married. It wasn't the one printed on his business cards. It was something else entirely, sharper, colder, foreign to my ears. The agents behind the glass exchanged a look, and suddenly I understood this wasn't just about fraud or stolen money. This was about an identity built like a Russian nesting doll, layers upon layers, each hiding another truth. When they escorted me out, the lead agent asked a question I'd been dreading. You can protect him or you can testify, but you can't do both. Protecting him meant destroying my own life, possibly going to prison. Testifying meant erasing every good memory I had left and admitting I'd been living inside a lie. I thought about the nights he'd held me when I was sick, the way he'd remembered my coffee order on our first date, the warmth in his eyes the day we exchanged vows. And then I thought about the ledger in that manila file, the forged signatures, my signatures, the strangers whose lives had been appended because of money that had flowed through my hands. The breaking of the spell. I went home that night and sat at the same table where the file had been. The same table where I had once believed my life was ordinary. The clock ticked. My tea went cold. And somewhere deep inside me, I knew there was only one choice. The next morning, I called Agent Riley. My voice was steady this time. I'll testify. They let me see him one last time before the trial. It wasn't a reunion. It was an ending. When I walked into the holding area, he didn't smile this time. His eyes searched mine for weakness, for hesitation, but there was none left to find. He leaned forward and whispered almost tenderly, "You think you won, but you'll never really know who I am." And then they took him away. In the weeks that followed, my testimony became the cornerstone of the government's case. They uncovered layers of fraud, offshore accounts, a network of shell companies, all tied to a man with at least 3 names. And me? I was left to rebuild from ashes I didn't know I was standing in. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear his laugh in my memory. The same laugh I once heard in our living room and in that office. And I wonder if, somewhere, he's telling another woman the same lies, under yet another name. But there was one thing the FBI never told me, something I only discovered years later. The courtroom was colder than I imagined, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Every seat behind me was filled with strangers whose eyes carried silent judgment. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on my shoulders as I took the witness stand. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear of him anymore, but from the knowledge that speaking would be the final nail in a coffin I never wanted to build. Across the room, he sat in his tailored suit, the same way he had in the boardroom, the same way he had at our wedding, the same way he had on quiet Sunday mornings when we drank coffee together. But now, there was no warmth in his smile, just a cold, calculated mask. His eyes didn't flinch when I met them. When the prosecutor asked me the first question, my voice caught. How do you explain to a jury that the man you loved, the man you trusted with your home, your heart, and your future, was living a life you never even had the vocabulary to describe? I spoke about the bank transfers I thought were routine office expenses, about the client accounts I was asked to manage without ever meeting the clients. I recounted the night I followed him, the apartment filled with multiple passports, the name on each one different. I explained that the man I called my husband was also my boss, and neither of those names were real. When the defense lawyer tried to paint me as a willing accomplice, I felt the sting of tears. But I didn't break. I knew who I was, and I knew that my truth mattered. The day the verdict came, it was quiet, too quiet. The judge's voice felt distant when she said the words "guilty" on all counts. I should have felt relief, but instead, a hollow ache settled deep inside me. He didn't look at me when they took him away, and I didn't look back. Weeks passed. My apartment felt like a museum of someone else's life. His coat still hung in the closet. His books still sat on the shelves. I didn't rush to remove them. I needed to face them, to understand that erasing him wouldn't erase what happened. One night, sitting on the floor with a cup of cold tea, I realized something. Betrayal doesn't just break your trust. It rewrites your memories. Every anniversary dinner, every whispered "I love you," every shared joke now lived under the shadow of a lie. And the worst part? I would never fully know which moments were real and which were part of his performance. I thought about the interrogation room. The last time we spoke, I had expected him to deny everything, maybe even beg me to stay silent. But instead, he leaned forward, looked me straight in the eyes, and called me by a name I had never heard before. Not my name, Not the pet names we had shared, a completely different name, as if I was just another character in his web of identities. In that moment, I realized I had never truly known him at all. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear his laugh in my head, that same laugh I once thought was home. And then I remember, home was never a place with him. It was a stage. Sometimes the person you love the most is the one who writes your worst nightmares. But if you're listening to this, if you've been lied to, manipulated, or made to feel like your reality is a puzzle with missing pieces, you're not alone. The truth may shatter you, but it can also set you free. If you've lived through something no one would believe, Midnight Confession is here to listen. Share your story. And if you want to hear more truths that were never meant to see the light, subscribe, because secrets always find a way out.